Hey guys, tonight we're floating back to the late 1500s, a time of wooden ships, bad maps, and very optimistic Englishmen who thought the New World would basically be a big backyard garden with free gold and friendly locals. Spoiler, it wasn't. So, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and maybe a cup of something warm. We're heading to the Outer Banks of what's now North Carolina. Though back then, it was just a foggy stretch of coastline that everyone vaguely pointed to and called Virginia, because Queen Elizabeth liked to name everything after herself. And, well, she was the Virgin Queen. Of course she was. Tonight's story is about Roanoke, the colony that vanished, leaving behind a single cryptic word carved into a post. It's been called America's first mystery. But before we get lost in the eerie silence of that abandoned island, let's meet the people who somehow thought, yes, let's pack a few boats and go start a mini England in a swamp full of mosquitoes. England's new obsession: colonies, pirates, and glory. Our tale begins with Sir Walter Raleigh, pronounced Raleigh, though he himself would probably insist on something more dramatic like Rorley. Raleigh was the kind of man who wore expensive velvet even on ships, wrote poetry, and somehow convinced Queen Elizabeth that he was the right person to lead England's first serious attempt at a colony in the Americas. You see, in the 1580s, England was kind of like a teenager trying to keep up with Spain. Spain already had its empire: gold from South America, sugar from the Caribbean, a fleet of shiny ships. England had wool and some pretty good beer. So naturally, they wanted in. And the Queen, in all her strategic wisdom, decided to let Raleigh take the risk. Not because he was the best candidate, but because he was charming, ambitious, and possibly flirting with her in a way that was only mostly treasonous. In 1584, Raleigh got permission to discover and occupy remote and heathen lands, which, translated, means claim land that's already inhabited and pretend no one lives there. He sent a small expedition to scout the American coast, led by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow. They landed on Roanoke Island, a small, narrow stretch between the mainland and the Atlantic, and decided it was perfect. The locals, part of the Socotan tribe, were friendly at first, offering food and information. The Englishmen returned to Queen Elizabeth with glowing reviews. The place was fertile, the weather was perfect, and the people were basically waiting to be civilized. Of course, they left out the part about the hurricanes, the bugs, and the complete lack of infrastructure. England was thrilled. She named the region Virginia. Raleigh got his patent, and the grand plan was born: build an English colony, raid a few Spanish ships, and maybe get rich without actually doing any hard labor. The first expedition. What could possibly go wrong? In 1585, Raleigh launched the real attempt at colonization. This one was led by Sir Richard Grenville, a man known for his temper and complete inability to get along with anyone. He sailed with about 600 men, including a few notable names: Ralph Lane, who'd be left in charge of the colony, and Thomas Harriot, a scientist who actually knew how to observe things without stabbing them. The voyage went about as well as you'd expect for 16th century navigation. They managed to burn one of their own ships while it was still full of supplies, because, of course they did. They arrived at Roanoke months later, low on food and enthusiasm. The local Socotan people tried to be helpful at first, trading corn and fish, but the Englishmen, in typical colonial fashion, immediately started demanding more, building forts and assuming they were in charge. Relations soured quickly. Ralph Lane, who had all the diplomacy of a wet sock, began sending armed parties to borrow food. By spring, tensions exploded, and Lane killed a local chief named Wingina, who had, understandably, stopped finding the English charming. By 1586, the settlers were starving, homesick, and very ready to go home. When Sir Francis Drake happened to pass by with a fleet of warships, fresh off raiding Spanish ports, the colonists begged for a ride back to England. Drake, perhaps feeling generous, agreed. And just like that, the first Roanoke colony vanished, not mysteriously this time, just through sheer incompetence. Fun fact, they left so fast that a supply ship Raleigh sent later arrived to find the island deserted. The captain took one look, sighed, and sailed back home. That's basically the 16th century version of ghosting your entire settlement. The second attempt, the family edition. Now here's where things get interesting, and a little sad. In 1787, Raleigh tried again. This time, the colony would be more permanent, less militaristic, and include families, because clearly adding women and children would solve all the problems of starvation and hostile diplomacy. The new leader was John White, a talented artist who had been part of the earlier expedition. He was mild-mannered, optimistic, and, well, kind of the opposite of Ralph Lane, which was probably the point. The plan was to settle in Chesapeake Bay, where the land was better, but when the fleet stopped, basically said, nah, we're not going any further. Dropped them off and left. Historians still debate why. Some say he was in a hurry to go privateering, others think he simply didn't care. Either way, White and his 115 colonists were stuck at Roanoke. Among them was his pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias Dare. A few weeks later, on August 18, 1587, Eleanor gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. It should have been a moment of hope. Instead, it became the prologue to one of history's longest cold cases. The supply run that never came back, for a while. As summer turned to autumn, the colonists realized, again, that they didn't have enough food. The local tribes were cautious, some outright hostile after the first colony's behavior. So White decided to return to England for supplies, promising to come back as soon as possible. He arrived in England at the worst possible time. The Spanish Armada was preparing to invade. All ships were commandeered for defense. No one was allowed to leave port. White begged, pleaded, probably wrote some sad letters, but it took him 3 years, 3 entire years, before he could finally set sail again for Roanoke in 1990. When he reached the island, silence. The colony was gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty huts, overgrown paths, and a single cryptic word carved into a post: Croatoan. That was the name of a nearby island, home to a friendly tribe that helped the settlers before. White wanted to sail there immediately, but a storm hit. The ship nearly sank, and the crew refused to continue.
He never saw the colonists again. He returned to England heartbroken, convinced that his family, his daughter, his granddaughter, might still be out there somewhere, alive. The word that launched centuries of theories. And that's where the story turns from history into legend. The word Croatoan became the heartbeat of every theory that followed. Did the colonists move south to live with the Croatoan tribe? Did they die in a storm or scatter across the coast? Were they killed by disease, by famine, or by their own bad luck? There are clues, but nothing definitive. Later settlers claimed to meet Native Americans with gray eyes or who spoke English words, stories passed down through centuries of whispers. Archaeologists have found scattered artifacts, bits of English pottery here, a sword fragment there, but nothing that says, here they were. Roanoke remains, to this day, an unfinished sentence, a half-told story carved into wood and lost to time. The strange calm of failure. Here's the quiet irony. While the Roanoke settlers disappeared, their failure paved the way for later success. England learned from their mistakes, mostly that you shouldn't dump people on an island and leave for 3 years. By 1607, Jamestown became the first permanent English colony. It wasn't much better at first. They also had famine, fever, and cannibalism, but at least they survived. Raleigh, by the way, fell out of favor with the Queen. got arrested, and was eventually executed for treason years later. Poetic, in a very Elizabethan karma kind of way. But Roanoke, that quiet, wind-swept island, stayed empty. The forests reclaimed the fort. The sand buried the footprints. And the mystery became the lullaby of American history. A soft, unanswered question echoing through time. Let's drift for a bit. The waves around Roanoke are still restless, the same ones that swallowed ships and carried dreams across the Atlantic. Some nights, historians say the wind makes a faint sound through the grass, almost like whispering. Probably just the breeze, but still, you can imagine it saying the same thing carved on that post. Croatoan. Hey guys, still awake? Good. Tonight, we're staying on that quiet shore of Roanoke a bit longer, where the waves don't crash, they just sigh. The settlers are gone, the camp is empty, and all we've got is a carved word and a lot of theories. So let's take a slow wander through them. We'll start with the least dramatic one, the "they just moved" theory. Because sometimes history's biggest mysteries are just really bad communication. The "they moved" theory. This is the one most historians actually believe. It's not spooky, but it makes sense, which, in a sleepy way, is kind of satisfying. Remember that carved word, Croatoan? That wasn't random graffiti. Before leaving for England, John White had told the settlers that if they decided to move, they should carve the name of their new location somewhere visible. If they were in danger, they were supposed to add a cross symbol. No cross was found. So, by all logic, the colonists were saying, "Hey, we moved to Croatoan Island. Come find us." The island, today called Hatteras Island, wasn't far. The Croatoan tribe had been friendly, trading partners even. It would have made sense to join them, especially if food was running out and winter was near. There's archaeological evidence too. Fragments of English tools, gun parts, and pottery found at Hatteras suggest that at least some settlers lived there after Roanoke was abandoned. One archaeologist described it as a cultural blend, English items used in Native American ways. A quiet merging of two worlds that history didn't bother to write down. So maybe that's all it was. No massacre, no supernatural curse, just people adapting, surviving, and slowly fading into another culture. It's not mysterious enough for a Netflix special, but it's peaceful. And peaceful endings are underrated. The died horribly theory. Of course, not everyone likes peaceful explanations. Some theories go full disaster mode, because if you give people a mystery, they'll add blood. The died horribly version comes in several flavors. One says they starved to death. Another says local tribes killed them. A third blames disease. Starvation fits, considering that the island wasn't exactly fertile and they'd run low on supplies before. But you think there would be skeletons? No mass graves have ever been found. Nothing left behind but footprints of absence. As for attacks, relations with nearby tribes were tense, but not impossible. If there had been a massacre, there would have been signs. Destroyed fortifications, weapons, something. Instead, it looks like the settlers left in an orderly way, which for a bunch of underfed Englishmen is actually impressive. The disease theory has some merit. European diseases had already devastated indigenous populations across the Americas, and it's possible something equally nasty hit the settlers. But again, no evidence. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't even bother to explain itself. The lost at the sea theory. Then there's the version where they didn't die on land, they died trying to leave it. Imagine this. They build small boats, maybe decide to sail back to England or at least find better land. No navigation, no real maps, no sense of direction, just hope. They push off into the Atlantic, thinking they'll hug the coast. The Outer Banks are known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. For a reason. Even modern ships get wrecked there. So if a handful of wooden shallops tried to cross open water, well, you can guess how it ended. Some historians have pointed out that later reports from Spanish sailors mentioned shipwrecks or empty boats spotted near the Carolinas. Nothing proven, but plausible. It's a quiet, bleak kind of ending, drifting into the sea and never coming back. The ocean doesn't tell stories. It just keeps them. The assimilation theory, or the quietest ending. Now, this is my personal favorite, not because it's dramatic, but because it's oddly kind. It's the idea that the settlers joined local tribes, not just as refugees, but as family. They intermarried, adapted, and slowly became part of the community. By the early 1600s, later English explorers claimed to meet Native Americans with gray eyes or who spoke English words. Stories passed down through centuries of whispers. Archaeologists have found scattered artifacts, bits of English pottery here, a sword fragment there, but nothing that says, here they were.
Some even said they wore European clothes or used iron tools. Colonial rumors, maybe, or faint traces of the Roanoke survivors, decades later. The Lumbee people of North Carolina, for instance, have long claimed descent from those lost colonists. Their language and traditions include fragments that might possibly connect to English influence. Of course, there's debate, as there always is when history mixes with identity, but the idea remains beautiful in its simplicity, that they didn't vanish, they just became someone else. It's a story without ghosts or glory, just people finding a new home when the old one failed, softly absorbed into a world that knew how to live there better than they ever did. The weird theories, because there always are. Now, if you've spent any time on the internet, you know we can't end with reasonable explanations. We have to at least acknowledge the weird stuff, because somewhere between they moved and they starved, people decided this needed aliens, curses, or secret societies. Of course they did. There's the Croatoan curse legend, a later invention that shows up centuries after the fact. It says that the word Croatoan was cursed, appearing mysteriously before famous disappearances and deaths. Supposedly, it was found scrawled in Edgar Allan Poe's notes before he died, on the bedpost of Amelia Earhart's room before her last flight, and even in the journal of the pilot of the Lost Flight 19 in the Bermuda Triangle. Absolutely none of that is historically verified, but it's a fantastic campfire story, and that's probably the point. Roanoke's mystery became so iconic that it escaped history altogether. Then there's the alien abduction theory, which, yeah, let's just breathe through that one. Apparently, some people think the colonists were taken by skylights, which sounds less like history and more like someone fell asleep watching Ancient Aliens reruns. Another says they were wiped out by a hurricane, a theory that at least has weather on its side. The region gets plenty of storms, but again, there'd be wreckage. Huts don't vanish without a trace, unless nature takes centuries to clean up after you. Which, come to think of it, it did. The archaeological wild chase. Every few years, someone thinks they've solved it. A new dig, a new artifact, a new aha moment. And every time, it's almost something. In 2012, researchers re-examined one of John White's old maps. Under a patch of paper, literally a patch glued on top, they found a tiny drawing of a fort symbol, hidden, possibly, for centuries. Was it a secret plan for a second settlement? Maybe. The spot, called Site X, because of course it's called that, sits inland near the Albemarle Sound. Excavations there have turned up English pottery shards that date roughly to the 1580s. Enough to suggest that someone from Roanoke made it inland. But there's not enough to call it proof. It's like finding crumbs and wondering if they came from cake or bread. Meanwhile, on Hatteras Island, the old Croatoan territory,
digs have revealed more European items, some clearly from that same period. A belt buckle here, a nail there. Tiny, quiet hints that the story didn't end on Roanoke itself. It just moved off stage. And that's how Roanoke tends to go. Every new clue adds another question instead of an answer. It's not a puzzle you can finish, just one you can keep turning over like a smooth stone in your hand. The emotional aftermath, for the ones who left. Let's drift for a moment into the quieter side of this, because while we always talk about the settlers who disappeared, we rarely linger on the ones left behind, like John White. Imagine being him. He goes back to England to save his colony, and by the time he returns, they're gone. His daughter, his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, that bright, hopeful first child of English America, all gone. He spends his last years haunted by it, trying to convince investors and the Crown to fund another search. No one really cares anymore. England's attention moves to Jamestown and the new wave of colonies. Roanoke becomes an old embarrassment. In his letters, you can still hear the ache. He writes about my people, my child, and my country left in Virginia. And that's what makes this story so human. Not the mystery, but the quiet grief behind it. The sense that sometimes history just stops answering. The myth of Virginia Dare. Now, about that baby, Virginia Dare. Over time, she became something much larger than a child lost to history. She turned into legend. By the 19th century, Romantic writers started spinning her story into allegory. She was reimagined as a symbol of purity, of lost innocence, of the birth of America itself. In some versions, she grows up among Native Americans and becomes a kind of forest spirit. In others, she's tragically turned to stone, a gentle echo of the Sleeping Beauty myth, but colonial edition. The Victorians especially loved her. There were poems, plays, even paintings of her in flowing white dresses looking wistfully towards the sea. You could say she became the ghost of America's beginnings, beautiful, doomed, and slightly overdramatic, which, honestly, fits perfectly into the long British tradition of turning failure into poetry. If you can't find your colony, at least you can make it sound romantic. The real legacy of Roanoke. Let's zoom out, because while Roanoke is remembered for its disappearance, its real story is about persistence. Every later English colony studied what went wrong there, the lack of supplies, the isolation, the poor relations with indigenous peoples, and tried, however imperfectly, to do better. Without Roanoke, there might not have been Jamestown. Without Jamestown, no Plymouth. Without Plymouth, well, half of your Thanksgiving decorations wouldn't exist. Roanoke's failure became the seed of future success, like compost, but historical. It taught the English Empire that survival in the New World required cooperation, supply chains, and maybe a little less arrogance. So in a strange, quiet way, that empty Ireland did its job. It was the first draft of America, messy, confusing, incomplete, but essential. Drifting towards the present. Today, Roanoke Island is peaceful again. There's a small town, some reconstructed buildings, a visitor center where you can buy Lost Colony mugs. Every summer they even perform an outdoor play called The Lost Colony. It's been running since 1937, longer than most TV shows and with fewer plot twists. Visitors wander the sandy paths where the settlers once walked, trying to imagine their lives, the creak of wooden boats, the sound of unfamiliar birds, the endless horizon that must have felt both thrilling and terrifying. If you stand there at dusk, with the wind moving through the reeds, it's not hard to see why the story endures. It's not about what happened. It's about what didn't. The silence. The space where history should be. And maybe that's the real reason we keep coming back to it. Because every so often we need a mystery that refuses to be solved. Something that stays open,